we're thinking really seriously about being able to meet in room 13 and 14 after today. And we're getting that ready electronically to be able to Zoom, because some people join us on Zoom.
That's
And
right.
so hopefully that will be ready to go by next week. And the way it's going to work is that we're going to be able to do it with 3 feet of separation if people maintain their masks. And then that particular configuration has some good ventilation. There are windows on both ends. And so we'll keep the ventilation open so that we can get a breeze going through. And so you may want to bring your coat to room 13 and 14 after for next week.
Nope. Don't need no coat.
We're waiting to get the Zoom ready. Are we ready? Okay. Our presenter today is Gordon Jackson. And Gordon and Sue have been involved in our church since 2015. A journalism professor at Whitworth University. And then they saw that he had some talents in administration, so they pushed him into administration as well. So he was very involved in Whitworth University for a number of years. And so he's retired. And in adult ed, we kind of have a variety of things that we'd like to present or cover for our faith journey. One is a theological idea that is intriguing, or another would be that we have an ethical issue that we really want to investigate. But another issue is be able to hear from one of our colleagues about how faith works in their life. What does it mean to really be a Christian in this period of time? And how do they make sense out of their own faith? And that is the thing that Gordon is going to do. He's written 17 books. He has some books on sale today. And so you can purchase one of those books or more today. But we're excited to hear how that makes sense in his life, his writing. So Gordon, we're glad you're here, and you're sort of stuck with this mic.
Sorry, what is that, Dave? I'm going to be going over there. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. I will be talking today about writing in general and how that affects my faith, or rather how my faith affects my writing. And then next week, I'll focus specifically on a subtopic, which is writing fiction. I've now done 3 novels, each of them with a satirical, humorous bent, and the 3rd one is going to be coming out in the next few weeks. So I want to focus a little bit next week on the novels. But today I want to do 2 things. The one is to speak about writing in general, and then go on to say, well, so what? What has that got to do with my faith? And all the while, I hope that you'll be saying, what has this got to do with me? I always think we want to be applying stuff to our lives. And I hope that I can get past this being a session about me, talking about what I've done, what I've written, and say, what has it got to do with you? And I hope that at the end, you'll be able to find at least one thing that you can take away with you today. So I hope that we can coordinate well with the slides and the technology. I'm hoping this microphone doesn't fall off my ear, or that my ear doesn't fall off either. And that, Richard, I'm ready to go with the first slide if you are. Okay. Writing as an act of faith. I think that everything that we do as Christians should be an act of faith, that we are doing everything to the glory of God. So let's move on through a few more slides to set the tone for us. Next slide, please. This is my attempt to live out my faith through the written word. I've loved words ever since I was a young kid. I loved reading, and I grew up in a wonderful city in South Africa, Cape Town, which is by the sea. And while my friends would be out at the beach surfing, I'd be at home reading 500-page books instead. And I've always loved words and consequently writing as well. But that's one theme, one part of my life. The other part of my life is my faith, that I made a Christian commitment at the age of 12, and that has shaped my existence ever since. And it was in my 20s and 30s that I began to merge these in a more professional way. And as Dave said in the introduction, I've now done a number of books. The one thing that I'm going to ask your indulgence and forgiveness for this morning is the number of times I'm going to say I and my and mine. I once had a student who wrote a piece that had the word I something like 15 times in one page. And I just highlighted this and I said, this is really coming across as all about you and where's it connecting to the reader. And I'm afraid I'm not easily going to be able to avoid that same problem this morning. So I hope you can forgive me in advance for that. And if you can't, well, I guess that's your problem. Okay, next, please. It's easy, after all, not to be a writer. Most people aren't writers and very little harm comes to them, okay? Not many of us are writers. And there's a so what question that's going to underlie that observation that I'll come back to later on. And next, please. Snoopy, sometimes when you're a great writer, the words come so fast, you can hardly put them down on paper. And then he says, sometimes. Writing is hard work, sometimes. Sometimes it goes for me really easily, but usually not. And I want to spend a little time this morning looking at the writing process. But let's look first at another realm. Bach was a very deeply committed Christian. And he said the aim and final end of all music should be none other than the glory of God and the refreshment of the soul. And to the limited extent that I can, I try to ensure that all of my writing is infused with a commitment to doing the best I can for God, and that in some way it's going to refresh the souls of people who will encounter my writing. So I see the parallel there between that realm of activity and creativity and with what people do in writing. Okay. Here are 5 steps in the writing process. Whether you know it or not, anything you've ever written falls in this category. The first is you've got to come up with an idea. Whether it's an idea for a new book like this one, which is all about words, or whether it's something like a note to your spouse saying, I'll be at the store, I'll be back at 6:30. Something like that, incredibly basic, has got to have its beginnings in an idea. The second step is, if necessary, you're going to do some research. You're going to pull together the facts, the data that you need to make this writing come to be. The third thing is, especially if you're in an academic setting, you're going to have to do a lot of focusing of the material you've got. It may be that you've got enough material for 500 pages, but you're only going to write up 100. You're going to leave out a lot of stuff, but you want the best stuff. And I would tell my students in a journalism class that you need to have a facts pile that is this high. You need all of this stuff. And then to mix metaphors, you're just going to take the cream. If you've got 10 quotes from the mayor, you're going to take the best one or the best two quotes. You're not going to dump everything in. You're going to focus. Then the fourth step is where you actually, for the first time, put pen to paper or fingers to the keyboard. Now you're actually doing what most people see as writing. But you've been engaged in the writing process on the first 3 levels already. Then, as a friend of mine in graduate school said many years ago, and he was not alone, there's no good writing. There's only good rewriting. And that's polishing what you've done, refining, going over it. I think with this particular book, I must have reread the manuscript, the finished manuscript, probably 5 or 6 times. And each iteration, I would find more errors, more things that needed correction, or something that could be said just a little bit more effectively. So please see writing as a process. And I found this to be extremely helpful when working with students to say to them, look, where are you in the writing process? If you're all fussed and bothered because you think you're not going to do a good job, where are you? If you're just at the focus stage, you haven't written anything yet. If you're at the draft stage, don't panic that it's not good enough. You've still got to go to the polishing stage. The worst thing that can happen with a student coming up with an idea saying, I want to do a news story on such and such, is for that student to choose a lousy idea. You've got a 500-word story and they want to analyze the problem of evil. Not going to work. And so my job as an instructor was to kill bad ideas and to say to them, look, I've taught this stuff for 30 years. I know what I'm doing. I don't want you to waste your time and mine on an idea that won't work. The worst thing that a writer can do is commit hours and hours and days and weeks to writing a manuscript that is flawed from the beginning. If it's got a lousy foundation, if it's a lousy idea, you bag it. And I spend a fair amount of time coming up with ideas, making a note of them, maybe playing around with some ideas, and then finding, you know, this isn't going anywhere. Leave it, just set it aside. Maybe it's an idea that has merit and that later on I can come back to it. The new novel that'll be coming out in a few weeks began in fall of 2016 when I was volunteering as a principal at a missionary school down in Mexico. And I started writing it there, got up to about page 30 and had no idea where to go next. I'll say more about that next week. But I let it sit for a while, then came to it afresh and was able to say, aha, I can move in this direction. And so that novel is now complete. But often I will look at an idea and say, you know, this just isn't getting the traction it needs. I don't throw stuff away. I keep things. But often those are lousy ideas that are never going to see the light of day. But then there are the good ideas too that do come to fruition. And let's move on, please, to the next slide. Doesn't always go smoothly. And sometimes you can do a lot of writing and then find, this just isn't working the way I thought it would. And there are really 2 questions you need to ask. Is this a book that should be written? And is this a book that I can write? Because maybe it's a great idea, but it's not one that I'm able or willing to tackle. There are three different types of writing. The first one is a personal journal. I've kept a journal now since 1983, and that is a private document. Sue doesn't get to see it. My kids don't get to see it. And I'm not quite sure what will happen to the journals after I die. I may follow the advice of someone who said, if I should die before I wake, please throw my journal in the lake. Okay? That's private stuff. Some of you may keep a journal. You may find it helpful. I find it very stimulating for my own spiritual growth. But there's another kind of writing that's very functional. It was that note you left saying, I'm going to be home at 6:30, or a grocery list that you're preparing. Or if you're in an organization, you're in charge of doing the minutes for the meeting we had last night. Those are all kinds of functional, very predictable kinds of
I'm
writing.
trying to get to the Zoom meeting ID so you could go into every phone, okay?
And then the third category is what I call imaginative writing, or what some people call creative writing. It could be anything from a novel to a short story to a book like this, which is nonfiction, but it's all about words. And this book didn't exist until I decided I wanted to have fun writing about words. And that's what this book consists of. So let's move on, please, Richard. Here are my main rules regarding writing. The first rule, and it's a very difficult one to instill in my students, it was difficult at times for me to observe, and that is you are not writing for yourself. That's when you're writing your journal. I'm writing on self-indulgent things there, but no one else gets to see that. For this, everyone who's going to be reading it needs to be benefiting from a book that was designed and prepared for them. And it's really difficult as a writer to keep that focus in mind. The second thing is to remember where you are in that 5-step writing process. And to say, if I'm getting bogged down here, it's okay. This isn't the final draft. I've got time to fix it. I've got ways of juggling things here. I may want to set it aside for a day or two. There's a problem here. It just isn't working. If I'm working on a novel, it may be the plot isn't convincing enough. Or I have doubts that this character is coming across as I want. I need to do more there, and I don't know what to do. So I'm just going to wait. That's one of the luxuries of being retired, is that I don't have to work on deadline for some news editor. I'm writing at my speed, and I can set stuff aside if I want. The hardest thing for any writer is not to fall in love with what you've written. What I write is really good stuff, all of it, except it isn't. And some of you know the name Eugene Peterson, who was a wonderfully prolific writer. He also paraphrased the Bible into the Message, which some of you will have it in your homes. And he said that 90% of what he writes, he throws away. I don't work with that kind of ratio. I cannot imagine throwing away that much of your writing. But the principle remains, you cannot afford to fall in love with what you've written. I remember the draft of my first novel, which was the book, The Church That Used to Be St. Elmo's. Some of you I know have read that. And that had lots of stuff in the first draft that I thought was excellent. It was funny, it was imaginative, and it was quite beside the point. And it had to go. I think I threw out about a third of what that manuscript had. And I had to get back to the rule that I drummed into my students and which I had broken repeatedly. And I had to say, get back to the rule, Gordon. Don't fall in love with the stuff. Yes, it's good, but it doesn't belong here. Out it goes. Then the final one is that rule I mentioned earlier. There's no good writing, there's only good rewriting. My mind goes to that wonderful movie, Amadeus, about Mozart and his genius. He was someone who could write flawless music first time round. And if you know the movie and remember it, Salieri looked at what he had done in sheer disbelief. There are, I'm sure, a few writers out there who operate at genius levels like Mozart, and they can write flawless stuff first time round. I'm not one of those writers, and I think 99% of people who write are in the same category. You've got to go back and polish and revise and revise. Okay. Whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. So we're coming now to the question, well, what has all this got to do with my faith? Now, I'd like to make some observations here. The first is that my faith is the foundation for everything that I do. Any major decisions that Sue and I will make will be shaped by our Christian commitment. But whether it's raising children, whether it's deciding to move to Tuscaloosa, whether it's anything to do with our lives, our faith is the preeminent screen or filter through which we view everything. So it's obvious then that I need to try and honor God through my writing. And whether it's a book of quotations about the media, or whether it's a book of quotations about paradoxes and puzzles, which I had great fun putting together, or whether it's a serious book about Christians and censorship and free expression, which was a scholarly book that came out the year I retired. And incidentally, it took me 8 years to get that book published. Writers at times need to be extremely patient and to persevere. Whatever the topic, one accepts that it's to God whom I need to be turning for my help, for my direction, but specifically to honor him in my work. And I want to just read a brief excerpt from this book, which is a secular book. It's a book for a general audience, and it's got everything in here about words, whether it's to do with acronyms, whether it's to do with puns, whether it's to do with words about words. And I included in here a section titled, "And the Word was with God," which you will recognize as being from the opening of John's Gospel. And I'm going to read to you just a few paragraphs here. I mentioned how it's central to the faith that we believe in the incarnation and that we see see Jesus as God incarnate. We can say at least two things about John's choice of words. First, a word is about communication. It has an inherent meaning for us to interpret and understand. In this case, Christians believe Jesus was the Word, God himself revealed to humankind. Just as words make tangible our unspoken thoughts, so did Jesus make the invisible God visible through his incarnation. Second, in addition to who he was, he had a word to share, to tell us through his life and teaching what God is like and what he expects of us. At the risk of seeming flippant, it is as if God intervened in history and tapped humanity on the shoulder and said, "Listen up, I have a word for you." So that is a way in which I could quite naturally fit in something about words into a book that is for a secular audience. And one needs to be careful about not being preachy in that setting, but I think that particular entry worked well for this particular book. The next thing I'd want to mention is I am no good at marketing. And that's a bit of a problem when you're trying to sell books. And I think of Billy Graham in this connection and an unusual event that happened, I believe, in 1948. Billy Graham was at that stage a very little known evangelist, but William Randolph Hearst, who at that time ran a chain of newspapers, you will know his name perhaps, he heard Billy Graham in action and he sent word to editors of all his newspapers, puff Graham, which in journalistic terms was give this guy a lot of coverage, make him look good. And that was a turning point in the ministry of Billy Graham. And as a result, he became America's most celebrated evangelist. I look at the work that I do, and I, of course, keep hoping for William Randolph Hearst's successor to say, puff Gordon Jackson and all his books. And I know that's not going to happen, but I trust God to do with each of these books whatever he wants. It's as if I find myself saying, God, I've now done the book, I'm handing it over to you. And then 6 months later, I get a royalty statement, and then I feel bad that God's book is doing so badly. I say that tongue in cheek. Obviously, I want to see success. I want to see the books do well. But I know too that point number 4, this is all ephemeral work. In human terms, I'm going to be gone relatively soon. My books are going to be gone from any prominent place relatively soon. Even if this makes the New York Times bestseller list, it'll be replaced the month after by other books. And I focus on what I can do now. That's my, that is my calling. I like the quote from a prayer book I read, and that is, with God, nothing is wasted or incomplete. So my efforts, even though they may not get very far, for example, that book I mentioned on Christians and censorship, it sold so far just on 100 copies, all of them to academic libraries, I'm sure. So it's not as if that got a whole lot of attention, and I still accept that nothing is wasted and nothing is incomplete with that particular effort. The biggest problem I face isn't the writing, it's ego. That's why I said at the beginning of our time that you must please forgive me for talking about me and my. It's impossible for writers to separate out their ego from what they're doing. And there was one writer who said, writers all want one thing, and that is praise. And that's part of the craft. If you're in the CIA, the work that you do doesn't get known. You're not going to get praised for what you do. But writers are by definition engaging in a public arena. They're putting their work out there. They're putting their soul out there. And what you want is for people to come and say, that was marvelous. Oh, that was so good. And dealing with the question of ego is an ongoing and constant problem. And then I would mention something because this may interest you. You may think writing is my calling. No, it isn't. This is just something that I happen to do using gifts and skills that I have, given my history, my background, my interests. But I don't feel called to writing. If God were to call me tomorrow to be a missionary to outer Bongo, and that was a clear call that God said, this is what you need to do, that's then what I would do, and writing would go by the wayside. So writing is important to me. It keeps me focused, gives me an outlet, but it's not something that I have to be doing. Whereas I think a calling is something that you are required to do. Okay, next slide, please. 2 other thoughts. I write books that I would like to read. I think of a book such as this new one, I said, I've not seen a book quite like this. There are lots of books about words. There are lots of grammar books out there, or words, or books on word usage. But this one is a kind of a romp. It's a lighthearted look at words. I was having fun writing it, to the point where sometimes it was a bit over the top, and my family had to rein me in as they read the manuscript. But it's a book that's meant to be fun to read. Other books have a different purpose. So the one that I did on Christians and censorship made the argument that Christians of all people should be championing free expression. Christians often are very much seen as curmudgeons trying to stomp down things. We don't want these books in our schools. We shouldn't have this book in our libraries, etc. So that was a book I wanted to see written, and it wasn't out there. So I set about writing it. Then to mention the 3 stages in which my faith applies. The first is that the basic idea needs to be something that I think would be pleasing to God. And my assumption is that God gives me a lot of latitude in that. If he wants me to put together a collection of quotations about children, I can imagine him saying, yeah, that's fine. Go with that. That looks good. Am I going to write one of those trashy romance novels with a bodice ripper cover on the front of the book, talking about all these sexual dalliances? I don't think God would have me do that. I don't see that as something, that I'd be able or interested in writing, but certainly it's not something that I could see bringing honor to him in any way. So at the idea stage, faith is operative. Then as I'm writing, I am not conscious of God's Holy Spirit flowing through me, the words pouring out as if this is scripture. No, that doesn't happen for me. But I'm conscious that I'm working as someone who is in some ways shaped by God's Spirit, and I'm seeking to honor him in that process. I'm confident that the work will be more pleasing to him than it would have been if I were not a Christian. And then thirdly, I've mentioned that afterwards, with the marketing stage, after the book has appeared, I need to hand it over to God and say, now it's yours, over to you to do what you can with it, what you choose to do with it. Then we'll have that slide by Kurt Vonnegut Jr., who says, God lets you write, God lets you not write. So I have the luxury, as I said, being retired, of putting stuff aside if I don't want to work on it, or picking it up when I want to. I've got several other projects in mind right now, but for now, I'm happy to keep writing, knowing I don't have to do it indefinitely. Okay, let's look at the next slide, please. And this is the question I asked early on. What has this got to do with you? How does this all apply to you? Well, I'd like you to leave today remembering your own creativity, and whether it's something you're good at, let's say in the kitchen, let's say you're good at music, let's say you're good at gardening, or I know people in this room who are good at photography, like David at the back there. I know others of you who are skilled in doing things around the house in a way that I am not. Whatever it is you're gifted at, see that as part of your spiritual DNA, that God has given you this gift of creativity. So ask, what is your giftedness? Or more accurately, what is your giftedness at this stage in your life? It may be that when you're 20s, you're a great athlete and you could work with young kids, excuse me, as a coach, and that skill has left you now. You're not as agile as you were when you were in your 20s. But there are things that you can do now, maybe with wisdom of looking back over the decades, that you're skilled at maybe counseling people in an informal way. Maybe you're skilled at befriending people. And that's something you found you can do and that you enjoy, and something that you should pursue more fully. And then ask, what is the biggest barrier you face in using your gifts? And it may be that you find time is a problem to do the things you know you can do well. Or is there something else? Maybe there's a feeling of insecurity. No one would appreciate what I'm doing. And so you hold back from that. Look carefully at what it is you are able to do. And then a quotation I loved to share with my students, and that is, have your tools ready. God will find you work. From the English clergyman, Charles Kingsley, who in the 1800s spoke with thys and these. God will find thee work. If we're serious about our faith, God is eager to use us to do his work, and we need to be open to his leading and direction. Okay, let's go to the final slide, please. Questions that you may have. We'll come to them in a second. Then I want to mention that some of my books are on sale at the back, and that the proceeds above my cost will go to the scholarship fund for our sister church in El Paso. And as we've done before, any of the books that I sell, I don't make a profit on them. It's just to cover my costs. So you can do two good things. One is help with scholarship funds, and the other is stroke my ego by buying the books. Next week, I'll talk about fiction writing, and maybe in your questions, you want to ask what I should talk about, or suggest what I should talk about next week. So that wraps up part one. Part two, we'll look specifically at novels for next week. But Dave is ready to roll with a microphone, and let's see if you do have any questions.
I'd like to know, Gordon, if the fiction that you're writing now, did you start out with nonfiction before you started writing these fiction books?
Yes, I started writing out nonfiction, and my first novel came out, I think, in 2017. And I especially enjoyed venturing into fiction, which is why I'm going to spend some time on that next week. But I'm working now on some nonfiction ideas too. I'm really fortunate that I can write whatever I like. Is that answering your question, Don? Okay. Any other questions?
I very much admire that you have that beautiful ability and have listened to what God is speaking to you. But my question is, it sounds like you have lots of ideas. What helps you make a decision as to what you really want to delve into?
Say the last part again, please, Diane. What prompts me?
How do you make that decision as to what you actually are going to pursue? And because, you know, you could have 50 different ideas, but what prompts you to make a decision where you want to focus?
That's a difficult question to answer, because I will have a number of ideas that I think are viable, but then I will dig into them and then find that I'm not getting anywhere. And as I said earlier, I'll just set that aside. Maybe it's a good idea. I've got chapter 1 written, which I wrote quite a while ago. It's a great introductory chapter for a novel, but I have no idea what comes next. And it's sitting there, It's an entertaining chapter. It's a satirical style of writing, but I don't know which of half a dozen directions it should go. But it can stay there. I'll be incubating it for a while, and maybe it'll never go anywhere. I will start writing some things and then find that I really generate enthusiasm and traction, and then I just keep going. This one started out as a collection of very simple jottings and thoughts about topics. And I said, I think this has potential here. So I just kept going. I got on a roll with this one. And that went, in some ways, fairly easily. But other books are a struggle. Yeah.
Hi, Gordon. I'm wondering, do you talk to Sue about your writing, or do you have, is it totally solitary, or do you have interactions? Like you just have to talk about this as you're working through how you're going to write it?
What happens is I will typically complete a manuscript, and then I give it to Sue and my two kids, both of whom in different ways are very good critics, and they will set me straight on things. And writing at that stage is no longer solitary. And I then have a group of other readers. There are some people whom I will go repeatedly. I'll go to them repeatedly and ask for their input. There's a former student of mine who lives in Boise, who's a journalist, and she's always a very good and honest critic. And there are others as well who I will turn to for input. And I am at least willing to realize that other ideas sharpen and strengthen the book and get rid of errors. So that's where the family comes in. They're at that stage where I've got a draft ready to show people.
Thanks, Gordon, for today. My question is for next week, as you are seeking, things we might like to hear. I'd be interested to know your process as you've moved into fiction, in terms of creatively. Do you find your characters emerge as characters purely? How much of your personal previous current life makes its way into those characters? Do some of them become thinly veiled forms of the person you've struggled with or appreciated, or those kinds of things? I always am intrigued with that. So if you could look at that.
For next week.
For next week.
Yes.
Thank
Okay. Anyone else?
I'm going to put in a little plug for your books, the two fiction ones. The church that used to be St. Elmo's, if you haven't read it, you really ought to. It is, I think, a depiction of any normal church in the United States. The characters in it, it's almost like, oh, were you at our church when you read that book or wrote that book? But it's any church. I mean, I've been in other churches there, and you have certain characters in every church that kind of fit some of these descriptions. But the point is, both of the books, those fiction ones, that and the Never Say Moist at Wendover College, those have some kernels of truth in them that are, I think, well worth reading and thinking about, as well as both books just being a really enjoyable read. So I think anybody who hasn't read them ought to pick them up and read them.
Thank you. Collect your fee later, please. Okay.
Well, just to plug for our church library, I believe those books are in the library. Now, that wouldn't get you any funding, but just so you all know.
Yes, my question is for me, in that when you write notes, or we were also just, Diane and I were challenged to write love letters to our kids. Do you go through the same process of, idea and then write and rewrite? Or how do you suggest that we might approach
Sorry, say the question again, please.
that?
Rick.
When you write a letter,
Yes,
and we were challenged to write love letters to our kids, would you
okay.
go through the same process of the 5 steps, or do you just kind of let it flow?
When I'm writing an email, I have an idea. I may need to gather some information, but there's not a whole lot of focusing that's needed. So that's not much of an issue. I'll do a draft, but then I'll go through it very carefully to make sure that it's accurately spelled, that the grammar is okay, because I don't want to be seen as sending out sloppy work, even if it's an email. So I think that 5-step process applies to that kind of writing, which is very informal usually, but I'd say it applies to your writing letters to your kids. You don't want to send something that's got typos in it or is sloppy in some way. You want to have it be as good as you can make it. So I'd say that process works pretty much across the board for all kinds of writing. Maybe not the note you're leaving for Diane saying you're going to be home at 6:30. I mean, that's not very, yeah, yes. Okay. Well, I think we have exhausted the questions unless there's anyone else. Oh, Don.
Well, I'm just going to put in a word for your first books. Like to laugh, folks. Read this first 2 books. A lot of humor in them. Nice way to spend an afternoon.
Yeah. Well, thank you. You're talking about the novels, are you? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Never say moist at Windover College. Yeah. Okay. Well, we are done. Thank you so much for being here today. And I look forward to seeing, I hope, all of you next Sunday. Thank you.